Samantha had always been the picture-perfect wife. At least, that's what Greg thought. After 10 years of marriage, he believed they had a bond that couldn't be shaken. Sure, things had become a little routine, a little predictable, but that was normal, wasn't it? Greg never imagined that the monotony of their lives would open the door to something he never expected. It all started on an ordinary Friday night. Greg came home from work, exhausted from another grueling day at the office. Samantha was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine. "Pizza tonight?" she asked, her tone light and casual. Greg nodded. "Sure, sounds good. Same place as always?" "Yeah," Samantha said, already reaching for her phone. "You know I love their thin crust." Greg chuckled and plopped down on the couch, flipping through channels. About 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Samantha practically skipped to answer it, a little more eager than Greg expected. He brushed it off, assuming she was just hungry. The delivery guy was young, maybe mid-20s, with a wiry frame and a mop of messy blonde hair. His name tag read, Evan. Samantha handed over the cash and lingered a moment longer than usual, chatting as she took the pizza boxes. "New here?" she asked, her voice warm. "Yeah, it just started last month," Evan replied, flashing a grin. "It's a decent gig." Greg watched the exchange from the couch, his interest piqued. Samantha seemed animated, more so than usual. When she finally returned with the pizzas, Greg raised an eyebrow. "Making friends with the pizza guy?" he teased. Samantha laughed it off. "Oh, stop. He's just a kid. Besides, I was being polite." The following week saw a noticeable change in Samantha's behavior. She began ordering pizza more frequently, often under the guise of saving time on dinner. Greg didn't think much of it at first. Who didn't love pizza? But then there were the small things. How she always insisted on answering the door, how her face lit up when Evan arrived, how she'd linger in the entryway longer than necessary. Greg's unease grew, but he kept his suspicions to himself. He didn't want to come off as paranoid. One evening, Greg came home earlier than expected. Samantha wasn't in the kitchen or the living room, and her car was still in the driveway. Puzzled, he wandered through the house until he heard muffled voices coming from the backyard. Peering through the window, Greg saw Samantha standing by the fence, laughing with someone. It was Evan, still in his delivery uniform, holding a pizza box. Greg's stomach tightened as he watched the interaction. Samantha's body language was unmistakable. The way she tilted her head, the way her hand lightly touched Evan's arm. When Greg stepped outside, the laughter died instantly. Samantha's face turned a deep shade of red, while Evan fumbled with the pizza box. "Didn't realize we were having company," Greg said, his voice cold. I should go," Evan mumbled, handing over the box and practically bolting for the gate. Samantha forced a laugh. "He was just dropping off the order. I thought I'd save him the trip to the front door." Greg didn't reply, but his gut told him there was more to the story. That night, Greg couldn't shake the image of Samantha and Evan. He stayed up late, scrolling through her social media, looking for any clues. Nothing seemed out of place, but his instincts screamed that something was wrong. The next day, Greg decided to test his theory. He called the pizza place and placed an order under Samantha's name, specifying a delivery time. Then he made an excuse to leave the house, claiming he needed to run errands. Instead, he parked down the street, waiting to see what would happen. Right on time, Evan's car pulled into the driveway. Greg's heart raced as he watched Samantha greet him at the door. This time, instead of handing over the pizza and leaving, Evan stepped inside. Greg clenched the steering wheel, his mind racing. How long had this been going on? What exactly was happening behind closed doors? Unable to sit idle any longer, Greg marched up to the house. He paused briefly before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The living room was empty, but faint laughter drifted from the kitchen. When Greg entered, he found Samantha and Evan standing closer than they should have been. Samantha's expression froze when she saw him, while Evan's eyes darted nervously around the room. "Am I interrupting something?" Greg asked, his voice sharp. No, Samantha said quickly. We were just talking. Evan muttered an excuse about needing to get back to work and left in a hurry. Greg turned to Samantha, his eyes narrowing. Talking, huh? Funny, it didn't look like just talking. Samantha crossed her arms defensively. You're overreacting. He's just a nice kid. Nice enough to come inside when I'm not here? Greg shot back. Samantha opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, her guilt evident. Greg's stomach churned. He didn't have proof of anything yet, but he was determined to find out the truth. Greg couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something was deeply wrong. Samantha's defensiveness, Evan's nervousness, and the strange tension in the air all pointed to one conclusion: there was more to their interactions than she was admitting. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Greg decided to take matters into his own hands. The next few days passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. Samantha acted like everything was fine, laughing at Greg's jokes and planning their weekend as though the awkward moment with Evan had never happened. But Greg's instincts told him otherwise. He noticed the way her phone seemed glued to her side and how she'd smile faintly when reading messages. Something wasn't adding up. Late one night, after Samantha had gone to bed, Greg saw his chance. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter, and he couldn't resist. Unlocking it felt like crossing a line, but he had to know. The messages were damning. Evan, last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. Samantha, me too. Wish we had more time. Maybe next week? Greg's hands shook as he scrolled through the exchange. There were dozens of texts, each one a nail in the coffin of their marriage. Flirty emojis, secret rendezvous plans, and even thinly veiled references to moments Greg didn't want to imagine. His heart pounded in his chest as anger and heartbreak collided. The next morning, Greg couldn't bring himself to confront Samantha outright. He needed a plan, something that would catch her in the act. So he waited, biding his time and playing along with her facade of normalcy. Over the next few days, Greg noticed patterns. Samantha's pizza orders seemed to align suspiciously with times when Greg was out of the house. Convenient errands and last-minute plans conveniently placed her at home alone, often when Evan was scheduled to deliver. On Friday evening, Greg made his move. He told Samantha he had to work late and left the house around 6 p.m. Instead of going to the office, he parked his car a few blocks away and walked back, positioning himself near the house where he could see the front door. Sure enough, at 6:45 p.m., Evan's car pulled into the driveway. Greg's jaw tightened as he watched Evan carry a pizza box to the door. Samantha greeted him with a smile that was far too warm for a simple delivery. They exchanged a few words before she stepped aside, letting Evan into the house. Greg's blood boiled. He waited for a few moments, giving them just enough time to feel comfortable, then marched up to the front door. His key turned in the lock, and he stepped inside to find the living room empty. Voices drifted from the kitchen. When Greg entered, Samantha and Evan froze. Evan stood by the counter, holding a glass of water, while Samantha's face turned an unmistakable shade of red. What's going on here? Greg demanded, his voice cold. Samantha stammered. I didn't expect you home so early. Greg's gaze shifted to Evan, who looked like a deer caught in headlights. And you? What are you doing here after hours? Samantha said she needed help with something. Evan mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Greg stepped closer, his voice low and steady. Cut the crap. I've seen the messages. I know what's been going on. Samantha's eyes widened. Greg, please. Don't. Greg snapped, holding up a hand. I want to hear it from him. Evan, how long has this been happening? Evan shifted uncomfortably. A few weeks, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Greg turned to Samantha, his expression hard. A few weeks? That's all it took for you to throw away 10 years of marriage? Tears streamed down Samantha's face. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was lonely, Greg. You've been so busy with work, and I just felt invisible. Greg's laugh was bitter. So, your solution was to hook up with the pizza guy? That's a hell of a way to fix things. Evan, sensing he was no longer welcome, set down the glass of water and edged toward the door. I should go, he muttered, slipping out as quickly as he could. Left alone, Greg and Samantha faced each other in tense silence. Finally, Greg spoke. Why? He asked, his voice cracking. Why didn't you just talk to me? Samantha wiped her eyes. I tried, Greg. But you were always too busy. I didn't think you'd notice if I disappeared. Greg's heart ached at her words, but his anger overpowered his sympathy. You're right. I was busy. Busy trying to build a life for us, while you were sneaking around with a kid who delivers pizza. Samantha sobbed, but Greg couldn't find it in himself to comfort her. Instead, he turned and walked out the front door, needing space to think about what came next. Greg spent the night driving aimlessly, his mind racing with anger, betrayal, and disbelief. His marriage, the life he'd spent a decade building, now felt like a cruel joke. Samantha's words echoed in his head, her claims of loneliness, her accusations that he hadn't noticed her. Was he to blame for what had happened? Or was that just her way of justifying the unjustifiable? Eventually, Greg found himself parked outside his best friend Adam's house. Adam had been his confidant since college, the one person Greg trusted to give him honest advice. What the hell happened, man? Adam asked after Greg poured out the whole story over a late-night beer. The pizza guy? Are you serious? Greg nodded miserably. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But it's real. I saw the messages. I walked in on them. Adam leaned back, shaking his head. You can't blame yourself for this, Greg. Yeah, maybe you were busy, but that doesn't give her a free pass to cheat. You deserve better than this. Greg stared into his beer. What do I even do now? Do I try to fix it? Or do I just walk away? Adam's voice softened. That's up to you. But whatever you decide, don't make the mistake of thinking this is all on you. She made a choice, Greg. Remember that. The next morning, Greg returned home, steeling himself for what he knew would be an uncomfortable conversation. Samantha was waiting in the living room, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up as he walked in, clutching a tissue in her hands. Greg, she began, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I messed up. I don't even know how to explain why it happened. Greg sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. Try, he said simply. Samantha took a deep breath. I guess I felt like we were drifting apart. You were always working late, always stressed. I started feeling invisible, like I wasn't enough for you anymore. And then Evan, he made me feel seen. Greg's jaw tightened. So, instead of talking to me about how you felt, you decided to cheat? With the pizza guy? That's how you solved it. Tears streamed down Samantha's face. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it. Please, Greg, I'll do anything to make this right. Just tell me what to do. Greg's voice was quiet but firm. I don't know if this can be fixed, Samantha. I need time to think. For now, I'm staying at Adam's. As the days turned into weeks, Greg wrestled with his emotions. Part of him wanted to forgive Samantha, to believe that their marriage could survive this. But another part of him couldn't shake the image of her and Evan, couldn't forget the betrayal. He threw himself into work, hoping the distraction would bring him clarity. Meanwhile, Samantha's attempts to reconcile grew more desperate. She sent long, heartfelt texts, left handwritten notes on his car, and even showed up at Adam's house unannounced. Each time, Greg rebuffed her, insisting he wasn't ready to talk. One evening, Greg's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Curious, he opened it. Evan. Hey, Greg. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say something. Can we meet? Greg's first instinct was to delete the message and block the number, but something stopped him. What could Evan possibly have to say that would make any of this better? Against his better judgment, Greg replied. Greg. Fine. Tomorrow. 6 p.m. at the diner on Main. The next day, Greg arrived at the diner, his emotions simmering just below the surface. Evan was already there, nervously fiddling with a cup of coffee. He looked up as Greg approached, his face pale. "Thanks for coming," Evan said, his voice shaky. Greg sat down, folding his arms. "You have 5 minutes. Start talking." Evan swallowed hard. "First, I want to say I'm sorry. For everything. I never should have gotten involved with Samantha. It was wrong, and I regret it every day." Greg's expression remained stony. "Why did you do it?" Evan hesitated. "She was vulnerable. She talked about how distant things had gotten between you two. I guess I thought I was helping her feel better. But it got out of hand." Greg leaned forward, his voice icy. "Helping her feel better? By sleeping with her?" Evan flinched. "I know it sounds terrible. It was terrible. I wanted you to know that it wasn't about you. It was my mistake, and I'm sorry." Greg stared at him for a long moment before standing up. "Your mistake ruined my marriage. Don't contact me again." As Greg walked out of the diner, he felt no relief, no closure. Just an aching void where his trust used to be. Weeks passed, and Greg found himself at a crossroads. His conversations with Evan, Samantha's pleas for forgiveness, and his own internal battle had left him emotionally drained. It was clear that his marriage had been irreparably damaged, but moving forward felt just as daunting as staying in the past. One afternoon, Greg received a surprising call from an old friend, Emily. They'd gone to college together, and had stayed loosely in touch over the years. Emily's bright, cheerful voice brought a flicker of light into Greg's otherwise gray day. "Hey, stranger! I heard you've been going through a rough time. Want to grab a coffee and catch up?" she asked. Greg hesitated but eventually agreed. "Sure, why not? I could use a break from my own thoughts." Meeting Emily at their favorite coffee shop from years ago felt like a step back in time. Her infectious laughter and genuine interest in his life were a refreshing change from the tension he'd been living with. They talked for hours, reminiscing about college days and sharing updates on their lives. "You deserve to be happy, Greg," Emily said, her tone serious for a moment. "You've been through hell, but that doesn't mean you have to stay there." Her words stuck with him. For the first time, Greg began to consider the possibility of starting over, not just in his love life, but in every aspect of his world. Samantha, meanwhile, was struggling to come to terms with the consequences of her actions. She'd moved out of their shared home and into a small apartment, hoping that space might give Greg time to forgive her. She reached out occasionally, but Greg kept their interactions short and focused solely on logistical matters like splitting finances and finalizing the divorce. One evening, Samantha sent Greg a long email, pouring out her heart. "Dear Greg, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I've done a lot of soul-searching these past few weeks, and I've come to realize just how much I took you for granted. I don't expect you to forgive me or even reply to this, but I needed to let you know how deeply sorry I am. You didn't deserve what I did, and if I could take it back I would. I hope one day you can find happiness, even if it's not with me. You deserve that much. With regret, Samantha." Greg read the email twice, his emotions conflicted. Her words felt sincere, but they didn't erase the pain she'd caused. He decided not to respond, choosing instead to focus on his own healing. As Greg started rebuilding his life, his friendship with Emily grew stronger. Their casual coffee dates turned into hikes, movie nights, and long conversations about their hopes and dreams. Greg found himself smiling more, laughing more, and thinking less about the past. One evening, as they walked along a quiet trail, Emily turned to him. "Greg, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Of course. Do you ever think about dating again?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Greg stopped walking and looked at her. I've thought about it, but honestly I've been scared. What if I'm not ready? What if it goes wrong again?" Emily smiled gently. "You can't let fear keep you from trying. You're a good man, Greg. Anyone would be lucky to have you. Her words stirred something in him. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of love. Samantha's life, on the other hand, continued to spiral. Evan, realizing the affair had caused more harm than he'd anticipated, began pulling away. Their once exciting relationship lost its spark under the weight of guilt and reality. One day, Evan showed up at Samantha's apartment, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. Samantha's heart sank. "What is it?" "I think we should end this," Evan said. "I thought we had something, but all we've done is hurt people. I can't keep doing this." Samantha felt a pang of loneliness as Evan walked out the door. She realized she was truly alone now, left to face the consequences of her choices. Greg and Emily's relationship blossomed naturally. They took their time, allowing their connection to deepen without rushing into anything. On a quiet evening, as they sat on Emily's porch watching the sunset, Greg reached for her hand. "Emily," he said, his voice steady, "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to see where this goes. With you." Emily smiled, her eyes bright. "I'd like that, Greg. I really would." For the first time in what felt like forever, Greg felt at peace. The past still lingered, but it no longer defined him. He was ready to move forward, one step at a time.